So I want to now switch over for just a couple of minutes on the latter part of our discussion and talk about some specific situations that you will need to be aware of. This tactile contact that can occur in campouts. This is, let me just talk about this. One of the ways in which sex offenders have been able to sexually abuse boys in campouts is under the guise of the massage. It's called a massage. It's usually related to kids having played football or wrestling or some other type of, contact sports during the day. They get back to their cabin at night or their tent, and whoever is the chaperone in that tent, typically a male, will say, "You really worked hard." This is how an offender can sexually offend against multiple children at one time. "You really worked hard. Let me give you a rub down. That's what they do with athletes. Let me make it better for you." This has been described many, many times. There are even child pornography videos that show how to do this. So the youth, 3 or 4 of them, will lie down on their stomachs, and the coach or I'm going to tell you he's going to be an offender, will get on his hands and knees, and he'll start rubbing the child's back, and then he rubs the buttocks, and he does that, for each of the children. "Doesn't that make you feel better? Let me help you with those muscles. Okay, so now why don't you roll over onto your back? Okay, let me just give you a good rub down here. Oh, you have too many clothes on. Why don't you take your shirts off? Let me see if I can get to those pecs." That's how the process begins. It's gradual. It's under the guise of, this is what you normally do to athletes. Everything's going to be fine. And before it's all over, this person will have these children completely nude, and he is rubbing them down everywhere. For him, he's getting sexual gratification from, in essence, fondling those children. And it can go further, because once he starts to massage and manipulate the anterior thighs, he's very close to their genitalia. The children might begin to get an erection. The coach will typically joke about that and say, "Oh yeah, that's really common." And then he will eventually encourage these children to have sexual contact with each other, which causes them to no longer be able to make a disclosure about him, because they will feel guilty about the behaviors that they themselves have participated with in with each other. So encouraging mutual sexual contact among youth is one of the first steps of an offender who's going to have a potential multi-victim scenario. So again, I'm not wishing to be graphic about this, but not only have I seen cases like this, not only have I seen it in child pornography videos that are on the internet, but I've also evaluated victims who have made disclosures about this to their parents, and it's almost always in a camping situation. It's almost always been in a camping situation. So let's talk about the normalization of sexual harm.
Guys online, but like in school or in public, we're not actually friends. Like, we're friends, but it's not like, "Oh, like, yo, come over to my house tonight." It's all online.
My code of guidance.
Before she started going online, Sarah was more reserved.
Like, once I was talking to my friend, and he was like, "Send me a picture." I was like, I don't want to send my a naked picture of myself, because I'm not comfortable with my naked body. He's like, "Fine, send it with minimal clothing on, and I'll send you one of me." So we're like, okay. So I went in the bathroom and I took the picture, and then I uploaded my computer and I emailed it to him, and then I deleted it off my computer. And it just was like something to do. It was didn't really mean anything. It was just like a picture.
I used to have 4 pages of myself on MySpace, but I lowered it down to 1. Yeah. And in the pictures, you kind of want to look hot, but you don't want to look too hot, so people think, "Ew, whore."
All of that dimple. My pictures, I try to smile on the side because my dimple.
Nice to meet you. No offense,
I like moving around, posing, doing this, doing that. Yeah. Model signs.
In a way, the social networking sites are this digital representation of what we think of as adolescence. So what teens are doing is going around and trying on these different identities. I'm a goth, or I'm a punk rocker, I'm a surfer, or I'm this or that. And the internet's allowed them to display that identity in a very dramatic and very succinct way.
I didn't want to be known as Jess. That was the last thing that I ever wanted, because all it did was remind me of the girl who had no friends. And I wanted to be the total opposite.
For Jessica Hunter, growing up in Madison, New Jersey was a series of daily humiliations.
I never fit the mold. I would try and try and try, and it just wasn't me. I was constantly being made fun of. People would push me into my locker. They'd constantly be calling me a goth. I felt so insecure. I felt like an alien, you know, in this all-white bread town.
But online, Jessica was reborn as the goth model and artist Autumn Eddowes.
Email address, profile, everything. Everything was Autumn Eddowes.
Her parents didn't know.
I knew that I could not tell them because they wouldn't understand. You know, like I would lie my ass off just to keep my identity sacred.
She just withdrew. You never saw her. She wouldn't eat with us. She just disappeared into her room. I would open her door, you know, try to get in. What are you looking at? You know, the screen would change, and you know, I was concerned. What's going on? Is she talking to bad people? What's going on here?
You know, I was only 14, but I looked like I was 18. You know, I'd be in like lingerie or something. And more people started noticing. Like, oh, you're so beautiful. Like, I love this picture of you. It like really got big. I was on the computer all day, replying. Like, I would hit the refresh button, and there would be like 10 more comments. It was crazy.
And this is a good example of what really is still very true in Facebook. A lot of our kids change their identities, you know, live through their fantasies in Facebook. And the more feedback that they get, the more blogs that they get, the more friends that they have, the happier it makes them, and also the more problematic it can become because they can become more extreme in the way that they are. You saw her picture and she said, I was 14, but I look like I was 18. Well, that's a reality today in America. The average age of onset of puberty for girls in America today is 9. Breast development typically begins at 9 and takes you 5 years to get through puberty. So by the time you're 14, for a girl in America, you are pretty much completely sexually mature. Periods begin usually about 2 years after breast development. So therefore, 9-year-old breast development, 11-year-old periods, 14 completely sexually mature as a body. Truly not as a brain, but very much so as a body. The National Center, therefore, along with other organizations, looks for children who are being exploited online, recognizing that any number that they give is going to be an underestimate. Because if a child has a body that looks completely mature by the time you're 13 to 14, then a pornographic image of that child will not be counted as child pornography because that child looks too much like an adult. They won't be able to tell that that child is only a 13 or 14-year-old. What are the impacts? The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is probably the most landmark study that we've had in the last 10 to 12 years. It's from the Kaiser Permanente system, and it is a study that shows that if you've had child sexual abuse as a child or any type of adverse child experience, another one is exposure to violence such as domestic violence, etc., it disrupts a child's neurodevelopment very often. It causes them to have a higher incidence of social, emotional, and cognitive problems, distractibility in school, which sometimes can be thought to be ADHD, which in reality is PTSD because they've been traumatized, and therefore decrease in their academic performance, leading then by the adolescent years to adoption of high-risk behaviors, drinking, smoking, using marijuana, et cetera, which then leads them to have a higher incidence of diseases and disabilities and social problems to include cancer, heart disease, and obesity, and an earlier death. So when we talk about the abuse of children in general, there are 3 ways in which it impacts them. First has to do with this, what I just described to you, it's the physical impact. But second is the emotional impact. The fact that kids who've been sexually abused grow up often having relationship difficulties. They have a higher incidence of depression, PTSD, and anxiety. They are at higher risk for substance abuse, though not always, bipolar disorder. But the most important factor is that they're at higher risk for re-victimization. And whether the offender is a religious person or not, many children also can develop something in the literature referred to as spiritual wounding, meaning that they are saying, why did God let this happen to me? What was it about me that God didn't protect me? I prayed and prayed. Why did that have to happen to me? Which can cause children, according to the literature, to lose two things: faithfulness and the ability to forgive and hope. So child sexual abuse is the injury to which sexual exploitation is the insult. The insult of this memorialization, especially because of 3G and 4G technology, as people use that in order to further promote their agenda, can be very, very ongoing. And what we now know is that whereas children who've been sexually abused are silenced, we talked about that earlier this morning, memorialization of that sexual abuse doubly silences them. And what we have discovered from international research is that if a child has been sexually abused and then pictures have been taken, because they are doubly silenced, they don't tell you about it in the first place. You find out about it because you found the pictures. These children often don't talk to therapists about it either. And if a therapist is not well trained, see, remember that in child sexual abuse and in almost all child trauma, traditional therapists use something called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the kind of therapy where you come in and I'll say, well, how was your week today? What do you want to talk about? And you talk about what you want to talk about, and we kind of go in that direction. The child or the victim drives the therapy. What we know about child sexual exploitation is that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, doesn't work well because the children will never bring up what has been so traumatic to them, in part because they're sort of protecting the therapist, in part because they don't want the therapist to know how ashamed they still are about what has happened to them. So the field has now moved to something called trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. So you come in for your therapy and I say to you, how are you doing today? Is everything going okay? What would you like to talk about? Well, one thing that we do need to talk about today is what Mr. John did to you. You know, the therapists have to be trauma focused, which takes a special kind of training for therapists because not all therapists are comfortable with that. We've had decades of experience in researching child sexual abuse, but we've only had about 12 or 13 years in understanding child sexual exploitation. So that's why it's been challenging and still remains a challenge, not just in our country. Germany is the only country, to my knowledge, that has actually canvassed its mental health care providers, all of the mental health care providers who see children, and asked them how competent do they feel in providing therapy for children who've been sexually exploited. And 88% of the therapists said not competent at all. I don't feel comfortable with this at all.